A stone block weighing 1,200 tons sits 60 feet above ground at Baalbek. No crane on Earth today can lift it. Yet someone placed it there with such precision that engineers analysing the joints found tolerances tighter than modern construction standards. This isn't the only impossibility. Across 6 continents, massive structures exist that we can't replicate with current technology. Built by cultures that supposedly lacked even the wheel. The pattern keeps appearing. Stones cut with laser precision. Multi-ton blocks transported across impossible terrain, architectural alignments accurate to fractions of a degree, and always the same question hanging in the air like smoke. How? The conventional answer involves ramps, ropes, and unlimited human labour. Thousands of workers dragging stones across rollers for decades. It's mathematically possible, technically feasible, and utterly unconvincing when you stand before a 70-ton granite block fitted so tightly against its neighbour that you can't slip paper between them. What if the answer isn't more primitive than we thought, but more advanced? What if these cultures understood principles of physics we're only beginning to rediscover? The Coral Castle in Florida offers a starting point. Between 1923 and 1951, a Latvian immigrant named Edward Līdzkalnis single-handedly quarried, carved and assembled over 1,100 tons of coral rock into an elaborate complex. He worked alone, mostly at night, using tools he built himself. When neighbours asked how he moved blocks weighing multiple tons, he'd smile and say he understood the secrets of the pyramid builders. After his death, researchers found his notes, references to magnetic currents, focused energy, and manipulating the relationship between mass and gravity. He'd somehow figured out something that allowed a man weighing 100 pounds to move stones 10 times his weight without modern machinery. His method died with him, but his achievement stands as proof that one person, working with unconventional understanding, accomplished what shouldn't have been possible. Now multiply that by entire civilizations. The Pumapunku complex in Bolivia sits at 12,800 feet above sea level. The stones there display characteristics that disturb engineers. Perfectly flat surfaces within tolerances of 0.02 inches. Drill holes with uniform depth and diameter. Interlocking joints cut in 3 dimensions with no visible tool marks. The stones are andesite and diorite, materials ranking 6 to 7 on the Mohs hardness scale. Bronze tools, the hardest metal available to pre-Columbian cultures, rank around 3.5. You can't cut what's harder than your cutting tool. It's not a matter of patience or skill, it's physics. Yet someone did cut them. Someone achieved surface flatness that modern machining struggles to match. Someone created geometric precision across hundreds of components that fit together like 3-dimensional puzzles. Christopher Dunn, a precision engineer who spent decades in aerospace manufacturing, examined the blocks in 1986. His conclusion was blunt. The evidence suggests diamond-tip drilling, water jet cutting, or some technique involving vibrational or chemical manipulation of stone we don't currently possess. The mainstream explanation points to copper tools and abrasive sand, wearing away at stone over months or years. But experiments replicating this method have failed to achieve comparable precision. The tolerances are wrong, the surface characteristics don't match, and the time required exceeds reasonable construction timelines. Something else was happening at Pumapunku. Something that allowed pre-Columbian builders to work stone with a finesse that suggests they weren't fighting against the material's hardness. They were bypassing it entirely. Ancient Sanskrit texts from India describe vimanas, flying machines powered by mercury vortex engines and controlled through sound frequencies. For decades, scholars dismissed these as mythology. Then engineers started actually reading the technical specifications. The Vaimanika Shastra, compiled from ancient texts in 1918, contains detailed construction diagrams, metallurgical formulas for heat-resistant alloys, descriptions of energy systems using rotating mercury and specific geometric configurations, flight maneuvers and navigation techniques. In 1895, Shivka Bapuji Talpade reportedly built a working model based on these principles. Witnesses claim it flew. British colonial authorities suppressed further research and the prototype disappeared. Whether Talpade succeeded or not, the texts themselves present a problem. They contain engineering knowledge that's oddly specific. Ratios and proportions that shouldn't work if someone was just making things up. The kind of details that come from either genuine technical understanding or an elaborate hoax requiring expertise the supposed authors didn't have. Modern attempts to reconstruct Vimana technology have produced intriguing results. NASA engineer Travis Taylor examined the specifications in 2015 and found that several describe propulsion systems theoretically sound within advanced physics models. Not practical with current materials, but conceptually valid. The texts also describe what they call sound weapons and force fields generated through specific harmonic frequencies. Acoustic levitation is now a demonstrated phenomenon in laboratories. We can suspend small objects using focused sound waves. The principle works. Scale it up, apply it to construction, and suddenly those impossible stone movements become merely difficult rather than supernatural. Egypt's Great Pyramid contains over 2 million limestone blocks, each weighing 2.5 tons on average. The King's Chamber features granite beams weighing 70 tons, transported from quarries 500 miles away. The structure is aligned to true north within 0.015 degrees. Its base is leveled to within 1 inch across 13 acres. This level of precision wasn't matched in Western architecture until the 19th century. Engineer John Bush calculated that building the pyramid in 20 years, the timeframe Egyptologists assigned to Khufu's reign, would require placing one 2.5-ton block every 2.5 minutes, working 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. That's the average. Some blocks weigh significantly more. The interior passages contain blocks fitted with such precision that Graham Hancock, investigating in the 1990s, couldn't insert a credit card between joints. The descending passage maintains a slope accurate to 0.5 degrees over its entire 350-foot length. Conventional Egyptology explains this through copper tools, wooden sledges, and massive labour forces, but the math keeps creating problems. The tool marks don't match copper tools. The precision exceeds what human-powered sledges can achieve. And no evidence of the supposed massive workforce has been found. No worker villages of sufficient size, no corresponding food production infrastructure, no skeletal remains showing the repetitive stress injuries such labour would cause. Christopher Dunn's analysis in 1995 identified something else. Core drill samples extracted from granite blocks showed feed rates, the speed at which the drill advanced, 500 times faster than modern diamond-tipped drills cutting the same material. Whatever tools the Egyptians used, they weren't primitive. The Antikythera mechanism, recovered from a shipwreck in 1901, is a bronze device containing over 30 precision gears. It tracked astronomical cycles, predicted eclipses, and calculated planetary positions. It's the most sophisticated mechanical computer known until devices of similar complexity appeared in 14th century Europe. It was built around 100 BCE. For 2,000 years, nobody could make anything comparable. Then suddenly, medieval clockmakers reinvented gear-based computation. Where did the knowledge go in between? Why didn't the technology spread and evolve? The answer might be that it did spread, and we're looking at fragments of something much larger that collapsed. The Baghdad battery, discovered in 1936, is a clay jar containing a copper cylinder and an iron rod. When filled with acidic liquid, it generates electric current. Conventional archaeology dates it to 250 BCE, dismissing it as a curiosity with no evidence of widespread use. But if you know how to make one battery, you know electrical principles. You understand current flow, conductivity, and chemical reactions. That's not isolated knowledge. That's systematic understanding suggesting broader technological capability. Gold-plated objects from the same period show electroplating characteristics. The even coating thickness, the lack of brush marks, the penetration into fine details, techniques that wouldn't be rediscovered in Europe until the 19th century. Small pieces keep surfacing. A 2,000-year-old astronomical calculator, electrical devices in ancient Mesopotamia, Sanskrit texts describing flying machines, Egyptian precision that exceeds modern capabilities, each one dismissed as anomaly, coincidence, or misinterpretation. But what if they're not anomalies? What if they're remnants of sophisticated technological understanding that got lost when civilizations collapsed? The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis suggests a catastrophic event around 10,800 BCE. Evidence includes a thin layer of platinum, nanodiamonds and carbon spherules in geological strata worldwide, markers consistent with extraterrestrial impact or airburst. The event corresponds with sudden climate disruption, megafauna extinction, and the disappearance of the Clovis culture in North America. It also aligns with the construction date of Göbekli Tepe. That site in southeastern Turkey predates agriculture, writing, and pottery. Yet it features precisely carved pillars arranged in ceremonial circles, requiring organizational capacity and technical skill that supposedly didn't exist yet. The builders appeared, created something magnificent, then deliberately buried it around 8000 BCE. What if Göbekli Tepe isn't the beginning of civilization, but the end? What if it represents survivors trying to preserve knowledge after most of their world was destroyed? The flood myths aren't myths. Over 200 cultures worldwide have nearly identical stories. Advanced civilization destroyed by water, survivors carrying knowledge to primitive peoples, gods descending from the sky teaching agriculture, astronomy, and architecture. Different names, same narrative structure, same specific details. The Sumerians called them the Anunnaki. The Egyptians knew them as the Neteru. The Mayans recorded them as the feathered serpent. Hindu texts describe the Devas, all of them descending after a catastrophe, all of them teaching the same advanced knowledge, all of them eventually leaving or dying out, with their students preserving fragments of what they learned. We're not looking at primitive humans slowly discovering technology through trial and error. We're looking at survivors of an advanced culture trying to rebuild with limited resources and diminishing knowledge, passing down what they could remember to descendants who understood it less with each generation. The massive stones weren't moved through brute force. They were moved through principles of physics these cultures still remembered. Acoustic levitation, electromagnetic manipulation, or something else we've only recently begun to rediscover. That's why the oldest structures are often the most impressive. That's why precision and capability seem to decline over time rather than improve. That's why so many ancient texts describe technologies as gifts from gods rather than human inventions. The knowledge was inherited, not discovered, and it was fading. 10 cultures across history demonstrated capabilities we can't explain through conventional archaeology. They moved stones we can't move. They achieved precision we struggle to match. They encoded astronomical knowledge requiring centuries of observation. And they all eventually vanished, leaving behind monuments that silently testify to what was lost. But there's something else these ancient cultures share, something that goes beyond stone and precision. They all possessed astronomical knowledge that shouldn't have been possible with naked eye observation alone. The Antikythera mechanism isn't an isolated curiosity. It's a data point in a much larger pattern. Ancient peoples worldwide tracked celestial movements with accuracy that required not just observation, but sophisticated mathematical frameworks and multi-generational record-keeping. The kind of infrastructure that doesn't appear overnight in supposedly primitive societies. The Mayans calculated the synodic period of Venus to within 2 hours over a 500-year cycle. That's 583.92 days, accurate to multiple decimal places. They knew the lunar month to 23 seconds. Their long count calendar, stretching back millions of years, accounted for precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that takes 25,920 years to complete one cycle. You can't discover precession through casual stargazing. You need centuries of precise measurements, maintained across generations compared against fixed reference points. You need institutional memory, written records, and mathematical sophistication. The Egyptians aligned the Great Pyramid to true north with an error of just 3/60ths of 1 degree. Not magnetic north, which shifts over time. True north based on stellar observation. The shaft angles inside the pyramid point to specific stars: Sirius, Orion's belt, Alpha Draconis. Not where those stars are now, but where they were in 2500 BCE. accounting for precession. That requires astronomical tables spanning thousands of years. The Dogon people of Mali, studied by anthropologists in the 1930s and 40s, possessed detailed knowledge of the Sirius star system. They described Sirius B, a white dwarf companion star invisible to the naked eye, with specific details about its density, orbital period of 50 years, and elliptical path. Sirius B wasn't photographed by modern telescopes until 1970. When asked how they knew, the Dogon elders said their ancestors were taught by visitors from that star system. Mainstream anthropology dismisses this as contamination from Western contact, suggesting French astronomers must have told them. Except the Dogon had incorporated this knowledge into their religious ceremonies and mythology for generations before Europeans arrived in their region. Hindu texts describe cycles of time called yugas, spanning 4.32 million years. The current age, Kali Yuga, began in 3102 BCE, according to their calculations. These aren't round numbers or symbolic timeframes. They're specific, suggesting actual chronological record-keeping extending back beyond written history. The texts describe previous cycles of rise and fall, ages of advanced knowledge followed by collapse and rebuilding. The Sumerian king list, recorded on clay tablets, documents rulers who allegedly reigned for thousands of years before a great flood, after which kingship descended from heaven again and lifespans became normal. The list transitions from mythological to historically verified rulers around 2600 BCE. The early section reads like legend, rulers living 30,000 years, cities founded by gods, but the later section matches archaeological evidence precisely. Same names, same sequence, verified through independent sources. Why would the same document be perfectly accurate for the historical period but complete fantasy for the earlier one? Plato described Atlantis in his dialogues Timaeus and Critias, written around 360 BCE. He claimed the story came from Solon, who heard it from Egyptian priests at Sais around 590 BCE. The priest told Solon that Egypt's records extended back 9,000 years before his visit, and they described a powerful maritime civilization that existed 9,000 years before that, making Atlantis roughly 11,600 years old from our perspective. The data lines precisely with the Younger Dryas impact event and the end of the last ice age. The priests weren't describing myth. They were reading from temple records. Plato's account includes specific details. The civilization possessed advanced metallurgy, working with gold, silver, copper, tin, and a mysterious metal called orichalcum. They had sophisticated agriculture, elaborate architecture, and a powerful navy. Their capital was arranged in concentric rings of land and water, connected by bridges and tunnels. The city had hot and cold running water, public baths, and a massive temple dedicated to Poseidon. Then it was destroyed in a single day and night by earthquakes and floods sinking beneath the ocean. For 2 millennia, scholars dismissed Atlantis as Plato's philosophical allegory. Then Heinrich Schliemann used Homer's Iliad, another supposed myth, to locate Troy in 1870. He proved that legends can preserve real places. The Bronze Age city was exactly where the poem said it would be, buried under centuries of settlement layers. If Troy was real, what else might be? The problem with Atlantis isn't the story, it's the location. Plato placed it beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the Strait of Gibraltar, in the Atlantic Ocean. Geological surveys show no sunken continent there, but what if the priests got the location wrong after 9,000 years of transmission? Or what if Plato misunderstood? What if Atlantis isn't a single place but a civilization that spread across multiple coastal regions, all of which were inundated when sea levels rose 400 feet at the end of the Ice Age? During the last glacial maximum, 20,000 years ago, vast areas of continental shelf were exposed. The Persian Gulf was dry land. Indonesia's islands were connected by plains. The North Sea didn't exist. Britain was attached to Europe. Massive coastal territories where humans could have built cities are now under hundreds of feet of water. We've explored less than 20% of the ocean floor. The shallow continental shelves where ancient coastal cities would have been located remain largely unmapped at high resolution. In 1985, marine geologist Robert Ballard, famous for discovering the Titanic, began investigating underwater sites in the Mediterranean. He found evidence of ancient settlements off Israel's coast, submerged structures off Greece, and preserved shipwrecks from the Bronze Age. He noted that the best preserved archaeological sites he'd ever seen weren't on land. They were underwater, protected from erosion, looting, and development. If advanced coastal civilizations existed 12,000 years ago, the evidence wouldn't be in the mountains. It would be on the sea floor. The Malta temples, officially dated to 3600 BCE, show evidence of much older construction underneath the visible structures. When excavators dug deeper, they found worked stones and sophisticated drainage systems in lower layers that carbon dating suggested were thousands of years older than the temples above them. The temples themselves feature massive limestone blocks weighing up to 20 tons, fitted with remarkable precision and decorated with intricate spiral carvings. They're aligned to specific solar and stellar events. The builders possessed geometric knowledge, astronomical understanding, and engineering capability that conventional timelines struggle to explain for Neolithic Malta. But here's what makes archaeologists uncomfortable. The temples show clear signs of having been deliberately buried, just like Göbekli Tepe. Someone carefully filled them with soil and rubble, not destroyed by invaders or abandoned to decay, intentionally preserved and hidden. Why would a culture bury their greatest achievements? One possibility is that they weren't burying monuments. They were creating time capsules, preserving knowledge for future generations who they knew would come after some catastrophe had passed. The structures themselves become the message. Massive, precisely aligned, astronomically oriented monuments that would survive millennia and eventually be found by whoever came next. Graham Hancock has spent decades investigating this possibility. His books, Fingerprints of the Gods and Magicians of the Gods, compile evidence from dozens of sites worldwide, arguing for a lost civilization of the Ice Age. He points to the Sphinx, which shows water erosion patterns suggesting it was carved during a period of heavy rainfall in the Sahara, around 10,000 BCE, not 2500 BCE as Egyptologists claim. He highlights Tiahuanaco in Bolivia, with its precisely cut andesite blocks and architectural sophistication, officially dated to 200 CE, but possibly much older based on astronomical alignments. He references the Yonaguni Monument of Japan, the submerged structures near Dwarka in India, and dozens of other sites that hint at human activity far earlier than accepted timelines allow. Mainstream archaeology dismisses Hancock as a pseudo-scientist cherry-picking data and ignoring evidence that contradicts his thesis. They argue that hunter-gatherers were perfectly capable of sophisticated achievements without requiring a lost civilization to teach them. Göbekli Tepe proves that monumental architecture predated agriculture, but that doesn't mean the builders inherited their knowledge from Atlantis. It means we underestimated what Neolithic peoples could accomplish through collective effort over time. But the pattern persists. Advanced knowledge appearing suddenly, precision and capability declining rather than improving over successive generations. Deliberate burial of significant sites. Global flood myths with eerily consistent details, astronomical knowledge requiring multi-generational observation programs, metallurgical techniques that vanish and must be rediscovered. Massive stones moved by methods we still can't replicate. Each piece alone is explainable. Hunter-gatherers had more time and capability than we assumed. Coincidences happen. Myths exaggerate. Natural formations get misidentified as artificial structures. But when you step back and look at the entire pattern across continents and millennia, the standard explanations start feeling insufficient. You're left with two possibilities. Either human capability in the Stone Age was vastly greater than currently believed, with isolated groups independently achieving sophisticated astronomy, engineering, and metallurgy before agriculture even existed. Or there was something that came before. something that rose, flourished, and fell, leaving only fragments and echoes that we're slowly beginning to recognize. The evidence doesn't demand belief, it demands investigation. Not dismissal, not blind acceptance, but serious inquiry into whether the timeline we've constructed is actually complete, or whether we're missing chapters that got erased when the ice melted and the seas rose. The survivors wouldn't have had metals, libraries, or cities. They would have had knowledge, and they would have spent their remaining years trying to pass it on, teaching whoever would listen, building monuments that might preserve something of what was lost. Those monuments speak in stone and alignment, but there's another language they use, one that requires no translation because it's written into the fabric of reality itself. Mathematics. The Great Pyramid at Giza encodes pi to 5 decimal places in the ratio between its height and base perimeter. The builders didn't need to understand the mathematical constant, they just needed to measure a circle and apply that ratio to their construction. Except pi wasn't formally calculated to that precision until the Greeks, thousands of years later. The pyramid also encodes the speed of light in its coordinates when expressed in modern measurements. The latitude of the structure, 29.9792458 degrees north, matches the speed of light in a vacuum, 299,792,458 meters per second. That's either the most extraordinary coincidence in architectural history, or someone chose that location for a very specific reason. At Teotihuacan in Mexico, the layout of the entire complex reflects the solar system with proportional distances between planets. The Pyramid of the Sun sits where you'd expect to find the asteroid belt. Each structure's placement corresponds to orbital relationships that wouldn't be documented by Western astronomy until the 20th century. The Mayans calculated the lunar month to within 7 seconds of modern measurements. They tracked Venus with precision that required centuries of continuous observation. Their calendar system, which ended its great cycle in 2012, sparked apocalypse fears not because they predicted the end of the world, but because modern people couldn't comprehend why an ancient culture would create a calendar spanning 5,125 years, unless they had profound astronomical knowledge. The Antikythera mechanism, recovered from a Roman shipwreck in 1901, took a century to understand. It's a bronze gear system with over 30 interlocking gears that calculated astronomical positions, predicted eclipses, and tracked the Olympic Games cycle. It was built around 100 BCE. Nothing even approaching its complexity appears again in the historical record until European clockmakers of the 14th century, 1,400 years later. When researchers finally decoded its function using X-ray tomography and digital reconstruction, they discovered it could predict solar eclipses with startling accuracy and track the irregular orbit of the moon using sophisticated mathematical modeling that shouldn't have existed for another millennium. The mechanism wasn't a one-off prototype. The complexity of its construction suggests it was part of a tradition, one device among many, most of which are now lost. These aren't primitive peoples making lucky guesses. This is sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics, encoded in structures and devices that were meant to last. But mathematics alone doesn't move 1,200-ton stones or drill perfect holes in granite. That requires something else. Technique. Modern engineers have attempted to replicate ancient construction methods using the tools supposedly available at the time. The results are humbling. In 1978, a Japanese team tried to build a small-scale version of the Great Pyramid using traditional methods. They gave up and brought in helicopters and bulldozers. They still couldn't match the precision. In the 1990s, stonemason Roger Hopkins and Egyptologist Mark Lenner attempted to quarry, transport, and raise a small obelisk using Bronze Age technology. The project took months, required dozens of workers, and the result was crude compared to ancient examples weighing hundreds of tons. Christopher Dunn, a precision engineer, spent years studying the Great Pyramid's internal chambers. His analysis revealed that the granite boxes in the King's Chamber were cut with tolerances of 2/10,000ths of an inch. That's modern machining precision. The surfaces are flat to within microns across expanses of several feet. Dunn documented evidence of circular saw marks in granite, requiring blades several feet in diameter. He found tube drill cores showing spiral grooves indicating feed rates that would require tremendous force and speed, far beyond what copper tools could achieve even with abrasive sand. The Egyptians, according to standard archaeology, accomplished this with copper chisels, wooden mallets, and sand. Copper has a Mohs hardness of 3. Granite ranges from 6 to 7. You cannot cut a harder material with a softer one, no matter how patient you are or how much sand you use. Experiments have shown that copper tools wear down almost immediately when applied to granite, yet the evidence of precision cutting is undeniable. The tools that created these marks either haven't been found or weren't preserved, or they weren't tools in the conventional sense. Some researchers propose advanced knowledge of acoustics and resonance. The granite chambers in the pyramid have acoustic properties that amplify specific frequencies. Certain tones produce standing waves that could theoretically affect matter at a molecular level. Tesla understood this principle and built devices that could shatter objects using resonant frequency. If the ancients understood similar principles, they might have developed methods to soften stone temporarily, making it workable before it rehardened. It sounds like science fiction until you examine the evidence at Sacsayhuaman in Peru. The fortress walls feature stones weighing over 200 tons fitted together with such precision that mortar wasn't necessary. The joints are so tight that you can't slip paper between them. But these aren't rectangular blocks. They're polygonal, with multiple faces meeting at complex angles, each one unique. Cutting rectangular blocks to fit tightly is difficult. Cutting irregular polygonal blocks with compound angles that interlock perfectly across 3 dimensions is exponentially harder, yet there are hundreds of them. Modern architects using CAD software and laser-guided cutting tools would struggle to replicate this. The Inca supposedly did it with stone hammers. Local legends claim the stones were softened using a plant extract. Spanish chroniclers documented these accounts in the 16th century, dismissing them as superstition. But what if the legends preserve memory of a lost technique? Certain plant compounds can affect mineral structures. Modern chemistry has created acids that dissolve stone, but those leave obvious traces. The Sacsayhuaman blocks show no such evidence. Whatever method was used left no chemical signature we can detect. Then there's the question of transport. Baalbek's trilithon blocks weigh 800 tons each. The stone of the pregnant woman in the nearby quarry weighs over 1,000 tons. Moving these stones would require coordinating tens of thousands of workers with perfect timing. The logistics alone are staggering. But assume it's possible. Assume Bronze Age engineers solved the coordination problem. They still face a physics problem. Moving 800 tons horizontally requires overcoming friction. Even with the most efficient rollers and lubrication, you need immense force applied gradually. Lifting 800 tons requires mechanical advantage, levers or pulleys, anchored to something stronger than the stone you're moving. Where are the anchor points? Where are the lever pits? Where's any evidence of the infrastructure such an operation would require? The silence in the archaeological record is deafening. No documentation, no tool caches, no experimental failures, no evidence of the learning curve such achievements should produce. Just finished monuments displaying capabilities we can't reproduce. Alternative explanations range from plausible to exotic. Some researchers suggest advanced wooden cranes and pulley systems that would have rotted away, leaving no trace. Others propose extensive ramp networks that were dismantled after construction. These explanations work on paper, but struggle when confronted with the actual stones and their positions. More controversial theories involve sonic levitation or electromagnetic manipulation. These sound absurd until you examine historical accounts of Tibetan monks allegedly moving stones using coordinated sound. Multiple Western observers documented these claims in the early 20th century, describing stones rising when specific drum and horn combinations reach certain frequencies. The accounts are anecdotal and unverified by modern standards, but they persist across cultures. Egyptian texts reference the words of power used to move blocks. South American legends describe sound devices that made stones light. Myths or memories. Physics doesn't forbid acoustic levitation. Researchers have achieved it in laboratory conditions using ultrasonic frequencies to suspend small objects in mid-air. Scaling this to architectural stones would require enormous power and precise frequency control, but it's theoretically possible within known physics. The question becomes whether ancient cultures possess this knowledge and the means to apply it. What if the monuments themselves are the evidence? What if structures like the Great Pyramid weren't tombs, but machines? Dunn's research suggests the pyramid's internal design resembles a power plant, with the king's chamber acting as a reaction chamber and the grand gallery functioning as a resonator. The shafts align to specific stars not for symbolic reasons, but for functional ones, channeling energy or information. This interpretation remains fringe, rejected by mainstream archaeology as speculative fantasy unsupported by evidence. But what counts as evidence? If a culture possesses technology, then loses it? What remains? The products of that technology. Structures that can't be explained by the tools we think they had. Precision that exceeds their supposed capabilities. Knowledge encoded in monuments that shouldn't exist. We're so certain that progress is linear, that civilization advances steadily from primitive to sophisticated, that we dismiss anything contradicting this model as impossible. We'd rather propose that thousands of workers spent decades moving 800-ton stones using rope and muscle than consider that maybe, just maybe, they had methods we've forgotten. The pattern appears globally. Advanced capability emerging suddenly, persisting for a period, then declining or vanishing entirely. Damascus steel, forged in medieval Syria, was sharper and stronger than anything Europe could produce. The technique involved carbon nanotubes embedded in the metal structure, something Western metallurgy didn't achieve until the 20th century. Then the knowledge vanished. Modern blacksmiths have spent decades trying to replicate it. Greek fire, the Byzantine Empire's secret weapon, burned on water and couldn't be extinguished by conventional means. The formula was lost after Constantinople fell. Roman concrete, used in the Pantheon, and countless structures still standing after 2,000 years, was superior to modern concrete in durability. We only recently figured out why. They use volcanic ash with specific mineral properties that create a self-healing crystalline structure. The knowledge disappeared during the Middle Ages. These are historical examples from documented civilizations, techniques lost within recorded history. How much more could have been lost in prehistory when no written records existed? When entire cultures could vanish beneath rising seas or advancing ice, taking their knowledge with them. The evidence keeps mounting. In the 1930s, archaeologists excavating ancient Baghdad discovered clay jars containing iron rods suspended in copper cylinders. When filled with acidic liquid, these jars produced electrical current. The Baghdad battery, dated to 250 BCE or earlier, proves ancient cultures understood electrochemistry. Mainstream archaeology dismisses them as electroplating devices for gilding statues. But that raises its own questions. Why does a culture need electroplating? What were they creating that required such precise metal coating? And if they mastered electrochemistry for decoration, what else might they have achieved? The Antikythera mechanism, recovered from a Roman-era shipwreck in 1901, sat in a museum for decades before anyone realized what it was. When researchers finally examined it with modern imaging technology, they discovered it was an analog computer. Built around 100 BCE, it tracked astronomical cycles, predicted eclipses, and calculated planetary positions using a complex gear system that wouldn't be matched in sophistication until 14th century European clockwork. One device, one artifact. How many others corroded to nothing at the bottom of the sea? Ancient texts describe flying machines. The Sanskrit Vaimana texts detail aerial vehicles with propulsion systems, weapons, and navigation capabilities. Mainstream scholars categorize these as mythology, symbolic representations of divine power. But the descriptions are oddly specific. They include measurements, materials, and operational procedures. The Samarangana Sutradhara, An 11th century text dedicates 230 stanzas to building and piloting these craft. It describes mercury vortex engines and electrical systems. Mythology doesn't need engineering specifications. Egyptian hieroglyphs at Abydos appear to show helicopters, submarines and aircraft. Archaeologists explain these as palimpsests, older inscriptions overlaid with newer ones, creating accidental resemblances to modern vehicles. The explanation is plausible. Pareidolia makes us see patterns that aren't there, but it doesn't explain why these particular overlays create such specific shapes, or why they appear in a temple dedicated to Osiris, the god of resurrection and rebirth. Coincidence piled on coincidence eventually stops feeling coincidental. Puma Punku's precision hints at something beyond primitive tools, but it's the mathematics that truly disturbs. The site demonstrates advanced understanding of geometry, proportion, and spatial relationships. The H-blocks aren't just precisely cut. They're designed using a modular system, standardized components that interlock in multiple configurations. This is industrial thinking, mass production methodology applied to megalithic architecture. Hunter-gatherers don't develop manufacturing standards. They don't create interchangeable parts. These concepts emerged with the Industrial Revolution. Yet here they are, carved in stones 2,000 years ago. Or older if the geological dating is correct. Göbekli Tepe's astronomical alignments track precession of the equinoxes, a 26,000-year cycle requiring centuries of continuous observation to detect. The builders positioned pillars to mark specific stellar configurations, including what appears to be a comet strike commemoration. This level of astronomical knowledge implies institutional memory spanning thousands of years. It requires a civilization, not scattered tribes. You need observatories, record-keeping systems, and scholars dedicated to tracking celestial movements across generations. All this before agriculture, before writing, before everything we think civilization needs. The mainstream timeline places the development of mathematics around 3000 BCE in Mesopotamia. But the architects of these sites were using sophisticated geometry 6,000 years earlier. They understood pi, the golden ratio, and trigonometric principles that Greek mathematicians wouldn't formalize until 2,500 years later. Either mathematical knowledge emerged twice independently, or it's far older than we acknowledge. The monuments suggest the latter. Consider the Giza Plateau. The three pyramids align with Orion's belt as it appeared in 10,500 BCE, not 2,500 BCE when they were supposedly built. The Sphinx shows water erosion consistent with heavy rainfall, something Egypt hasn't experienced since the end of the last ice age. Robert Schoch's geological analysis suggests the Sphinx could be 7,000 to 9,000 years old, carved during the African humid period, when the Sahara was green. The Egyptian government and mainstream Egyptology reject this dating because it implies a sophisticated culture existed before ancient Egypt, predating the pharaohs by millennia. What if the pyramids weren't built by the 4th dynasty? What if they inherited them? Egyptian texts distinguish between the time of the gods and the time of men. The Palermo stone and Turin papyrus list dynasties of gods and demigods ruling for thousands of years before the first human pharaohs. Mainstream scholars interpret these as mythological king lists, symbolic rather than historical. But what if they're chronologies? What if the gods were the survivors of the pre-flood civilization, remembered as divine because their knowledge seemed miraculous? The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis provides a mechanism. Around 10,800 BCE, something catastrophic happened. Ice cores show platinum anomalies consistent with extraterrestrial impact. Sediment layers reveal widespread burning and sudden climate disruption. Sea levels rose 400 feet as ice sheets collapsed. Entire coastlines vanished beneath the waves. If advanced civilizations existed during the Ice Age, they would have built along coasts where resources were abundant and trade routes accessible. Those sites are now underwater, buried under sediment and coral, lost to history unless we look. Marine archaeology has barely scratched the surface. Less than 5% of the ocean floor has been mapped in detail. Sonar surveys occasionally detect anomalies, geometric formations that resemble artificial structures. Most are never investigated. Funding prioritizes known historical sites, not speculative underwater searches. But the few investigations that have occurred found structures that shouldn't exist. Yonaguni, Dwarka, Bimini. Dismissed or ignored because they don't fit the timeline. The timeline is sacred. It's the foundation of modern archaeology, anthropology, and history. Questioning it threatens academic careers, departmental funding, and decades of published research. Institutions resist paradigm shifts because paradigms represent enormous investments of time, reputation, and intellectual capital. Thomas Kuhn documented this in The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Old paradigms don't die because evidence disproves them. They die when the generation defending them retires and a new generation accepts alternative models. Until then, anomalous evidence gets explained away, reinterpreted, or ignored. But the evidence keeps accumulating. Every decade brings new discoveries that push capabilities earlier. Göbekli Tepe was discovered in 1994. Before that, textbooks stated monumental architecture began with agriculture around 8000 BCE. One site demolished that assumption. How many others remain buried? Ground-penetrating radar shows Göbekli Tepe is only 5% excavated. The deepest, oldest layers haven't been touched. What will they reveal? DNA analysis is rewriting prehistory. Ancient human remains show far more genetic complexity than the simple out-of-Africa model suggested. There were multiple migrations, interbreeding events, and population replacements. Denisovan genes appear in modern humans, but we've found only a handful of Denisovan fossils. Entire populations existed that we know almost nothing about. If human populations were more diverse and widespread than we thought, why not human cultures? Linguistics preserves memory that archaeology hasn't found. Proto-Indo-European, the ancestral language of most European and Indian languages, contains words for advanced concepts. They had terminology for wheeled vehicles, metallurgy, and complex social structures. This language existed before 3000 BCE, spreading across vast distances. How did a sophisticated vocabulary develop and disseminate unless the culture creating it was equally sophisticated? Mythology encodes knowledge. The Dogon people of Mali knew about Sirius B, an invisible companion star to Sirius, before Western astronomers discovered it with telescopes in 1862. They described its 50-year orbit with surprising accuracy. Skeptics claim they learned this from European visitors, but the Dogon maintain this knowledge is ancient, passed down for centuries. Similar astronomical knowledge appears in myths worldwide, describing planetary movements, eclipses, and stellar configurations that shouldn't be observable without instruments. The Piri-Reis map isn't alone. The Orontius-Phineus map shows Antarctica ice-free. The Philippe-Boach map correctly divides Antarctica into two landmasses separated by a channel, confirmed only in 1958 when seismic surveys revealed the subglacial topography. These maps were drawn in the 16th and 18th centuries, compiled from older sources now lost. Where did those sources come from? Who mapped Antarctica before the ice? Every ancient text describing a golden age, a time before the flood when knowledge was greater and civilization more advanced, might be memory rather than myth. The Sumerians described the Apkallu, 7 sages who brought civilization after the flood. The Egyptians spoke of Zep Tepi, the first time when gods walked the earth. Hindu texts describe cycles of creation and destruction spanning hundreds of thousands of years. Mesoamerican traditions recount multiple worlds destroyed and rebuilt. These aren't isolated myths. They're global. Different cultures, different continents, same story. We stand at a crossroads. Either we accept that civilization is older than we think, that advanced cultures rose and fell before recorded history, leaving only fragments and monuments we struggle to explain. Or we maintain that every anomaly, every impossible precision, every astronomical alignment is coincidence, misinterpretation, or the result of techniques we haven't considered but that remained within primitive capabilities. One path requires rewriting history. The other requires ignoring mounting evidence. The monuments don't lie. They exist, precisely cut, astronomically aligned, too heavy to move with acknowledged technology. They're not going away. They demand explanation. And perhaps the most uncomfortable possibility is this. We're not the first technological civilization on this planet. We're just the first to forget we had predecessors. The stones remember, the maps remember, the myths remember. We're the ones with amnesia, convinced our progress is unique, that history begins with us. But history is deeper than we know. The evidence has always been there, waiting beneath the ice, under the waves, buried in the earth. We just have to be willing to see it. The stones stand where they've always stood. Baalbek's trilithon hasn't moved in millennia. The Great Pyramid still aligns to true north. Puma Punku's precision blocks lie scattered across Bolivian highlands, their impossible tolerances unchanged by time. These aren't mysteries that will be solved by finding one missing tool or discovering one lost technique. They're puzzles that dissolve the moment you stop insisting history moved in a straight line from primitive to advanced. We've built a timeline that makes sense to us, one where progress accumulates gradually, where knowledge compounds generation after generation until you get smartphones and particle accelerators. It's comfortable, it's logical, and it might be completely wrong. The alternative isn't comfortable. It suggests that capability can be lost, that entire civilizations can vanish so completely that their existence becomes myth, that we might be living in the rubble of something greater, mistaking inheritance for invention, rediscovering principles that were once common knowledge. The maps show coastlines that shouldn't be visible. The monuments demonstrate precision we struggle to match. The texts describe technologies that sound like fantasy until you examine them closely and realize they sound like engineering. Maybe we're not discovering the world. Maybe we're remembering it. And if that's true, then every impossible structure, every anomalous artifact, every myth describing advanced ancestors isn't a mystery to be explained away. It's a message we haven't fully decoded yet. The stones are still speaking. We've just forgotten how to listen.